Louis XIV was called the most beautiful king in European history, with a perfect physique and godlike charisma, who could dance ballet for 6 hours straight without breaking a sweat. Foreign ambassadors literally swooned when he walked by. This was a man who spoke 5 languages fluently and could remember the names of 3,000 nobles in his court. But here's what no history book will tell you. The same king who built the most magnificent palace in the world died as a 310-pound rotting, toothless mass of gangrenous flesh. His own courtiers had to wear perfumed masks just to approach him. The stench was so overwhelming that foreign diplomats vomited during royal meetings. And I've got the hidden medical records that prove every gruesome detail of how Europe's golden god became a walking corpse. Evidence French historians tried to bury for 450 years. If this shocking truth about absolute monarchy is news to you, smash that like button to help other people discover what really happened behind the palace walls. Because I'm about to reveal 3 horrifying medical secrets that will forever change how you see European royalty. Picture this. May 6, 1661, Palace of Versailles. Louis XIV, just 23 years old, descends the marble staircase in a ceremonial robe weighing 33 pounds and embroidered with real gold thread. A crowd of 5,000 holds its breath as this 5'8" king, with rippling muscles and gleaming black hair, passes by Venetian mirrors that reflect his absolutely perfect physique. The afternoon sun streams through crystal windows, casting golden light on a monarch who truly embodied divine perfection. His deep, commanding voice could be heard clearly from 150 feet away. When courtiers described his bright blue eyes, they compared them to shooting stars that seemed to pierce straight through to your soul. When he walked, his confident stride made the solid hardwood floors of Versailles actually vibrate under his feet. His natural masculine scent was so intoxicating that both men and women would literally swoon when he passed by. A far cry from what was coming. But here's what most people don't realize about the young Sun King. He wasn't just a pretty face with royal blood. This was a man who spoke fluent French, Latin, Italian, Spanish, and German by age 20. He could outfence his own Italian tutors, who were considered the best swordsmen in all of Europe. Louis XIV would dance ballet for 6 straight hours without breaking a sweat, then write poetry so beautiful it made the notoriously cold British ambassador openly weep when he heard it performed at court. The sheer physical capabilities of young Louis were almost superhuman. Court records show he would consume 4 full meals, plus 3 additional snacks every single day, while maintaining his muscular build. He'd hunt wild boar for 8 hours straight through the forests around Versailles, then dance until 3 a.m. without showing any signs of fatigue. His memory was so extraordinary, he could remember the names and faces of over 3,000 nobles in his court and recall personal details about their families. And his legendary appetite extended far beyond food. Palace servants discreetly recorded that he maintained intimate relationships with at least 12 different women every month. Foreign diplomats reported being stunned by what one Venetian ambassador called his almost supernatural charisma. When Louis XIV entered a room, conversations stopped, hearts raced, and even hardened political rivals found themselves mesmerized. This was the golden age of absolute monarchy, and Louis XIV was its perfect specimen. Every morning, over 100 nobles would literally fight for the honor of handing him his silk shirt during the famous lever ceremony. They'd argue over who got to hold his mirror, who could pour his washing water, who was worthy enough to tie his shoes. The evening coucher was another performance of royal magnificence, where grown men would compete desperately just to blow out his bedside candle. The Palace of Versailles itself was designed as a stage for this divine performance. 10,000 courtiers attended daily, with every single gesture choreographed for maximum impact. When Louis XIV walked through the Hall of Mirrors, the reflection seemed to multiply his godlike presence infinitely. The very marble beneath his feet was imported from Italy at a cost that would equal millions today, just so the Sun King's footsteps would echo with the proper imperial authority. But even in these golden years, there were disturbing hints of what was coming. Secret court physician records, only decoded in 1987, revealed troubling signs that everyone chose to ignore. By age 25, Louis XIV required 2 to 3 enemas every single day just to have a bowel movement. His chronic constipation came from consuming 6 to 8 meals daily in what can only be described as compulsive overeating. The warning signs were everywhere, if anyone had dared to look. His breath was so foul that he needed constant peppermint candies to mask the stench. His skin was oily and acne-scarred, hidden under layers of thick white powder and rouge. Court records show he suffered from chronic digestive issues that required daily medical intervention. Yet this was all carefully hidden from public view through elaborate court protocols designed to make weakness look like divine ritual. Most crucially of all was Louis XIV's complete refusal to bathe. He would only wash his hands and face each morning. That was it. His entire body was cleaned maybe twice in his entire lifetime. This wasn't unusual for the era, but it was based on the medieval belief that water weakened the body and opened doorways for evil spirits to enter. Louis XIV genuinely believed that his natural body odor was a sign of masculine power and divine authority. This fatal decision, avoiding water like it was the plague itself, would become the direct cause of the horrifying rot that was about to consume him. Because in January 1686, something would begin growing in the darkest, dampest region of the king's body, and what started as royal vanity would transform the Sun King into a living, breathing monument to human decay. The Golden Prince who danced until dawn was about to become something so grotesque that his own courtiers would flee from his presence. On January 15, 1686, Louis XIV, now 47 years old, summoned his personal physician with what he described as a small discomfort when sitting down. Dr. Guy Crescent Fagan, a man who had killed more patients than the Black Death itself, immediately diagnosed it as common hemorrhoids. But this wasn't going to be a simple medical issue. This was the beginning of a 30-year nightmare that would literally consume the Sun King from the inside out. Within 1 week, that small discomfort had transformed into stabbing pain that felt like a red-hot dagger every time the king moved. By January 22nd, the swelling had grown to the size of a walnut. By January 28th, there was constant bleeding, forcing Louis to sit on soft cushions during state meetings. Then came February 5th, the day servants first reported a strange odor emanating from the royal garments. By February 12th, pus and fecal matter were constantly draining through an external opening that had formed near his rectum. Imagine the most disgusting infection you've ever witnessed, then multiply that horror by 100. That's what was happening to the most powerful man in Europe. The smell was unlike anything the palace had ever experienced, a putrid stench that seemed to follow Louis XIV wherever he went. Dr. Fagan began his treatment with medieval methods that would make a torture chamber look merciful. First came the enemas, not just 1 or 2, but multiple freezing cold water enemas every single day. Over the next 6 months, court records show that Louis XIV endured over 2,000 enemas as Fagan desperately tried to cleanse the royal intestines of corrupted humors. When the enemas failed, Fagan escalated to red-hot iron cautery. They would heat metal rods until they glowed like coals, then press them directly into the infected tissue, while Louis XIV was held down by multiple courtiers. The screams could be heard 3 floors down in the palace, but still the infection spread. Then came the forced bloodletting. 500 milliliters of blood drained from the king's body every single day to purify his corrupted essence. The treatments weren't just failing, they were making everything dramatically worse. Strange concoctions appeared, prescribed by charlatans who convinced Fagan they held miracle cures. Bull's sperm mixed with wine, bull's blood combined with crushed pearls, frog fat dissolved in brandy. Each remedy was more disgusting and useless than the last, yet Louis XIV submitted to all of them in his desperate quest to maintain his divine image. By November 1686, the situation had become impossible to hide. The stench was so overwhelming that foreign diplomats were making excuses to avoid audiences with the king. Something radical had to be done, and that something would become one of the most horrific medical procedures in royal history. Enter Charles-François Félix, the royal surgeon who would either save the Sun King or kill him in the attempt. Félix knew he was facing an impossible challenge. Operating on the most powerful monarch in Europe without anesthesia, without proper surgical knowledge, and with the certainty that failure would mean his own death. So, he prepared in the most disturbing way possible. He practiced on 75 prisoners and volunteers. Every week for months leading up to the surgery, Felix would perform 3 to 4 operations on condemned prisoners, perfecting his technique on living human beings who had no choice but to endure the agony. He developed a specially designed curved silver scalpel called the Bistouri Royale, a blade created specifically for carving into the most private parts of the Sun King's body. November 18th, 1686. The day that would change everything. At 6 a.m., using secret entrances to avoid detection, the surgical team assembled in Louis XIV's private chambers. No anesthesia existed, no pain relief was possible, just 4 trusted courtiers to hold down the king's arms and legs, and a piece of wood for him to bite down on during the worst moments. What followed was 3 hours of conscious torture that would have broken lesser men. Felix began cutting with his royal scalpel, slicing through the infected fistula tract, while Louis XIV remained fully awake and aware of every incision. The smell that erupted when the blade opened the deepest part of the abscess was so putrid that 2 surgical assistants fled the room vomiting. Blood sprayed across the silk bed sheets like a crimson fountain. The king bit through the wooden block twice as Felix cut deeper, removing gangrenous tissue that had turned black with decay. At 9:15 a.m., when the scalpel reached the tailbone, Louis XIV screamed, "Mon Dieu!" for the first time, a cry of agony that echoed through 3 floors of the palace. Felix's secret surgical notes, hidden for 300 years and only discovered in 2007, describe extracting over 200 milliliters of green-blue pus that smelled like decomposing corpses. The infected tissue came away in chunks, revealing bone underneath that had been eaten away by the constant drainage of corruption. But the nightmare was just beginning. When Felix finally declared the surgery complete after those 3 excruciating hours, he discovered something horrifying. The wound wouldn't heal properly. The infection had spread too deep. The tissue damage was too extensive. Louis XIV would require not 1 surgery, but 4 separate operations. December 6th brought the 2nd surgery. December 8th, the 3rd. December 10th witnessed the final, most brutal procedure. 6 hours of cutting while the Sun King lay conscious, his body held down by 6 men as Felix performed what can only be described as butchery with surgical instruments. The total surgical time, 15 hours spread across 3 weeks. The amount of infected tissue removed, enough to fill a large wine bowl. The pain endured, beyond human comprehension. And still, the wound continued to drain, continued to smell, continued to rot the Sun King from within. When the surgeries finally ended and the wound showed signs of healing, court physicians declared it a miracle. But they had created something far worse than a simple medical problem. They had transformed Louis XIV into a man whose body would never stop decomposing, whose smell would become legendary, whose physical decay would require increasingly desperate measures to conceal from the watching eyes of Europe. By March 1687, the surgical wounds had finally healed. But they had created something far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. A permanent anal fistula meant that feces and pus would leak continuously for the rest of Louis XIV's life. The Sun King, once famous for his intoxicating natural masculine scent, now smelled like death itself. The transformation was immediate and devastating. Foreign diplomats who had once competed for audiences with the Golden Monarch were now making desperate excuses to avoid his presence. The Venetian ambassador wrote in secret dispatches that approaching the French king was like walking into a charnel house. The stench wasn't just unpleasant, it was overwhelming, nauseating, and impossible to ignore. Louis XIV's response was to launch what can only be described as the most expensive perfume revolution in human history. He spent the modern equivalent of $2 million annually on fragrances imported from every corner of the known world. Bulgarian roses, Arabian ambergris, Indian sandalwood. Nothing was too costly in his desperate attempt to mask the smell of his rotting body. The palace itself became a massive perfuming machine. Fresh flowers were replaced every 2 hours throughout Versailles. Specialized containers called cassolettes burned scented smoke continuously in every room the king might enter. Servants were assigned to spray furniture with perfume before Louis XIV sat down. Even the food was infused with aromatic oils to try to mask the smell of his breath. But perfume couldn't hide what was happening to his physical form. The trauma of multiple surgeries combined with his inability to exercise normally triggered a weight explosion that horrified even his most loyal supporters. From 165 pounds in 1670, Louis XIV ballooned to 265 pounds by 1700, then to an incredible 310 pounds by 1710. The king, who had once moved with athletic grace, now required 6 strong men to lift him onto his horse. His throne had to be rebuilt 3 times because he kept outgrowing it. Court portraitists were instructed to paint him from carefully chosen angles that hid his massive bulk. But foreign visitors weren't fooled. A Russian ambassador brutally noted that the French king smells worse than my horse and moves like a pregnant cow. Then came the dental catastrophe of 1693 that completed his transformation into something barely recognizable as human. A doctor, convinced that all illness stemmed from corruption in the mouth, decided to extract every single tooth from the king's head in one barbaric session. No anesthesia, no proper surgical tools, just crude metal instruments and the screams of a 55-year-old man being systematically mutilated. The results were grotesque beyond imagination. The doctor managed to tear away a part of Louis XIV's upper palate and fracture his lower jaw in the process. This created a permanent hole between his mouth and nasal cavity, causing food and wine to spray out of his nostrils when he tried to eat. His speech became slurred and difficult to understand, forcing courtiers to lean close to his reeking breath just to comprehend royal commands. Saliva now drooled constantly from his toothless mouth. Combined with the anal fistula and his enormous weight, Louis XIV had transformed from Europe's most desirable monarch into a drooling, obese, reeking caricature of royalty. Yet the most remarkable aspect of this decline was how desperately the court worked to maintain the fiction of his divine perfection. Versailles developed over 200 new protocols, specifically designed to hide the king's grotesque condition. A color-coded system using silk ribbons warned courtiers about Louis XIV's daily state. Red ribbons meant stay away. He was in pain. White ribbons meant an approach was possible, but aromatic masks were required. Black ribbons meant the king was having a particularly bad day with his bowel problems. The famous lever morning ceremony, once a 2-hour celebration of royal magnificence, was shortened to 30 minutes to limit exposure to the king's smell. The evening coucher was modified so Louis XIV could be secretly fitted with cloth padding to absorb the constant leakage from his fistula. Thick curtains were strategically placed to hide the process of changing his soiled undergarments. Environmental modifications were equally elaborate. Windows were opened in carefully calculated patterns to create air currents that would blow the king's odors away from visitors. 500 bowls of fresh flowers were replaced hourly throughout the palace. 50 specialized perfume machines operated around the clock, creating clouds of scented smoke to mask the underlying stench of decay. Courtiers were required to carry pomanders, decorative balls filled with aromatic substances, whenever they might encounter the king. Some visitors took to breathing through cloths soaked in perfume. The most delicate ladies of the court would excuse themselves and vomit after mandatory appearances before Louis XIV. Though they blamed it on sudden feminine ailments rather than admit the truth about their revolting monarch. Foreign diplomatic relations began to suffer, as ambassadors found it increasingly difficult to endure prolonged audiences with the French king. The English ambassador requested permission to conduct meetings outdoors for his health, while the Spanish representative began sending lower-ranking diplomats instead of attending personally. Some nations started questioning whether the Sun King was truly fit to rule if he couldn't even maintain basic bodily functions. Yet through all of this physical degradation and elaborate deception, Louis XIV maintained his iron grip on absolute power. The more his body failed him, the more desperately he insisted on the fiction of divine monarchy. Every protocol, every ceremony, every aspect of court life became part of an increasingly complex performance, designed to hide the fact that their god-king was literally rotting away before their eyes. But you haven't seen anything yet compared to what happened in his final months. The horrors that consumed Louis XIV in 1715 would make everything you've heard so far seem like a minor inconvenience. What awaited the Sun King in his last days would shock even the physicians who thought they had seen the worst of human decay. On August 11, 1715, at 4:30 in the morning, Louis XIV awoke with a scream of agony that shattered the pre-dawn silence of Versailles. His left leg felt like it was being consumed by fire from the inside. Dr. Fagan, now 72 years old and nearly blind, was summoned immediately. His diagnosis: sciatica from sitting too much. The most incompetent physician in French history was about to make his final, fatal mistake. What Dr. Fagan dismissed as simple nerve pain was actually the beginning of senile gangrene, a condition that would literally devour the Sun King alive over the next 3 weeks. By August 15th, the first black spots appeared on Louis XIV's big toe. By August 18th, the spots were spreading, and his skin felt burning hot to the touch. August 22nd brought a new smell, not the familiar stench of pus and feces, but something far worse: the unmistakable odor of rotting human flesh. By August 25th, even Fagan could no longer deny what was happening. The black discoloration had spread halfway up the king's foot. The smell was so overwhelming that servants were fainting when they entered the royal bedchamber. Modern medical experts confirmed that Louis XIV was suffering from dry senile gangrene, poor circulation combined with infection that could have been treated by amputation. But who would dare suggest cutting off the leg of a man who claimed to be appointed by God himself? The horror accelerated with each passing day. On August 28th, the big toe simply fell off while servants were changing the king's stockings. Courtiers collapsed at the sight of white bone protruding from the decomposing flesh. By August 30th, the gangrene had spread to his shin, and the putrid smell now filled 3 entire floors of the palace. Yet incredibly, impossibly, Louis XIV continued to rule. This is what makes the Sun King's final decline so extraordinary. He kept governing even as his body literally rotted away. He signed royal decrees with a trembling hand while his flesh was decomposing. He received foreign ambassadors while the smell of death emanated from his person. He made military decisions in a voice that was growing hoarse as the gangrene crept up toward his throat. The Venetian ambassador wrote in horror, "The French king is dying by degrees before our very eyes." The Austrian representative described it as the most gruesome spectacle I have ever witnessed. Yet still, the audiences continued. Still, the business of absolute monarchy carried on, even as the monarch himself was becoming a living corpse. Courtiers now wore perfume-soaked masks when entering the king's presence. The bed linens had to be changed every 2 hours as fluids leaked from the gangrenous tissue. 20 servants worked in shifts to care for Louis XIV, but many requested transfers because they couldn't endure the smell. The stench was so powerful, it could be detected from the palace gardens. Visitors could literally smell the Sun King's decay from hundreds of yards away. International reactions ranged from horror to fascination. Foreign courts sent physicians to observe this unprecedented royal decline. Medical professionals traveled from across Europe not to help, but simply to witness what they knew would be the most documented royal death in history. Letters and diplomatic reports flew across the continent, describing in gruesome detail how absolute monarchy was literally decomposing before the world's eyes. As August turned to September, the gangrene reached Louis XIV's calf, then his knee. Chunks of blackened flesh would fall away during the daily attempt to clean and bandage the affected areas. The king's leg looked like something from a battlefield, a mass of rotting tissue, exposed bone, and constantly weeping infection that defied every medical treatment of the era. September 1st, 1715, the final day. By 7 a.m., Louis XIV could barely speak as the gangrene had spread to his throat muscles. He called his great-grandson to his bedside and whispered in a voice like sandpaper, "Do not imitate me. I have loved war too much." These were among his last coherent words before the rot claimed his ability to communicate clearly. The Duc de Saint-Simon, who was present in the final hours, recorded the king's death throes with clinical precision. At 11 p.m. on August 31st, Louis XIV had experienced what we now know were the final stages of systemic gangrene. His body was shutting down as toxic tissue death spread throughout his left side. His final words, barely audible through his decomposing throat, were, "Oh my God, come to my aid. Haste to help me." At 8:15 a.m. on September 1st, 1715, the Sun King's heart finally stopped beating. But even in death, the horror continued. The royal body began decomposing with shocking speed. The infection that had ravaged him for weeks didn't stop just because his heart had ceased. Within hours, his already bloated corpse swelled even larger as bacterial gases built up inside. Dr. Maréchal performed the royal autopsy just 6 hours after death, working frantically before the body became too decomposed to examine. His report, hidden for 200 years and only discovered in 1891, revealed the full extent of the medical nightmare. The entire left side of the body from foot to head was gangrenous, the skin peeling everywhere. All the throat muscles were black with decay. The intestines were twice their normal length, containing an extraordinarily large tapeworm. The embalmers faced an impossible task. Louis XIV's corpse was decomposing too rapidly for normal preservation techniques. They worked wearing thick cloth masks soaked in perfume, but still several assistants fled the room, overcome by nausea. The body was so corrupted that they had to rush through procedures that normally took days. Even the funeral became a macabre spectacle. The coffin had to be sealed immediately and reinforced with extra lead, because the body continued to swell with decomposition gases. During the lying-in state, strange popping and gurgling sounds could be heard coming from inside the sealed casket as the Sun King's corpse literally fell apart. The final cover-up was as elaborate as any during his life. Official government announcements declared that the king died peacefully after a brief illness. The reality, 3 weeks of agonizing decay with his body rotting while he remained conscious, was deemed too horrible for public consumption. Within 48 hours of Louis XIV's death, a systematic destruction of evidence began. Dr. Fagan's detailed medical records were burned. Dr. Felix's surgical diary vanished for 300 years. The autopsy report was buried in secret archives until 1891. Import records for the massive quantities of perfume used to mask the royal decay were completely erased from official documents. The man who had styled himself as the Sun King, who claimed divine appointment and absolute authority, who built Versailles as a monument to royal magnificence, had died as a rotting, stinking, decomposing mass of infected flesh. The ultimate irony was complete. The monarch who believed himself godlike had died in a manner more degrading than the lowliest peasant, his body consuming itself while his mind remained trapped inside the horror until the very end. So there you have it. Louis XIV, the man once called the handsomest ruler in Christendom, died in putrid agony as his body literally consumed itself from within. The Sun King who built Versailles as a monument to divine monarchy ended his reign as a rotting, stinking mass of gangrenous flesh that horrified even his own physicians. Modern medical experts confirmed what 17th-century doctors refused to acknowledge. All of this could have been prevented. The anal fistula, basic hygiene and proper bathing, the gangrene, early amputation would have saved his life, but the arrogance of absolute monarchy and the belief in divine royal immunity doomed Louis XIV to die like a diseased animal rather than seek the medical help that could have saved him. The ultimate irony is staggering. The man who claimed to be appointed by God himself, who demanded absolute obedience from millions of subjects, who built the most magnificent palace in Europe, spent his final decades as a walking corpse whose own courtiers had to flee from his presence. The divine right of kings proved utterly powerless against the universal human experience of bodily decay and death. The Sun King's legacy remains not just as a symbol of royal magnificence, but as proof that absolute power is ultimately powerless against the most basic realities of human mortality. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next investigation. The year was 1305, and London streets echoed with the cries of vendors hawking their wares and the clatter of horse hooves on cobblestone. But on this August morning, a different sound would soon fill the air. The roar of a bloodthirsty crowd gathering to witness what would become one of history's most notorious executions. The man they came to see die was William Wallace, the Scottish knight who had dared to defy the English crown and unite his countrymen against foreign rule. What transpired that day was not merely an execution, but a carefully orchestrated theater of cruelty designed to destroy both a man and the symbol he represented. The popular imagination, shaped by Hollywood films and romantic tales, has sanitized Wallace's final moments into something almost noble, a quick death for a brave hero. But the reality was far more sinister and infinitely more brutal. King Edward I, known as Longshanks, had crafted Wallace's punishment not just as retribution, but as a message that would echo through generations. This was to be a death so horrific, so public, and so thoroughly documented that it would serve as a warning to anyone who dared challenge English authority. The method chosen was hanging, drawing, and quartering, a punishment reserved for traitors that represented the absolute pinnacle of judicial cruelty in medieval England. This wasn't simply about ending a life. It was about the systematic destruction of human dignity, the obliteration of hope, and the creation of a spectacle so terrifying that it would haunt the collective memory of Scotland for centuries to come. Today, we strip away the myth and examine the unflinching reality of William Wallace's final hours. To understand the full horror of Wallace's execution, we must first grasp the world that created it. Medieval Scotland in the late 13th and early 14th centuries was a land caught between independence and subjugation, where the concept of nationhood was still forming and loyalty was often determined by survival rather than sentiment. The Scottish Wars of Independence had erupted following a succession crisis, and Edward I saw an opportunity to bring Scotland under direct English control, viewing the Northern Kingdom as a rebellious province rather than a sovereign nation. William Wallace emerged from this chaos not as a nobleman seeking power, but as a minor landowner driven by personal loss and national outrage. His family had suffered under English occupation, and when he raised his sword at Stirling Bridge in 1297, he did so with the fury of a man who had lost everything and the vision of one who saw what Scotland could become. His victory there was more than tactical. It was symbolic, proving that English heavy cavalry could be defeated and that Scottish independence was not merely a dream. But Edward III was not a king who tolerated defiance. Known for his ruthless suppression of Welsh resistance and his expulsion of Jews from England, Longshanks understood that rebellion was like fire. It could spread, if not thoroughly extinguished. Wallace's success had to be not just reversed, but transformed into a cautionary tale. The English king needed to demonstrate that challenging his authority would result in consequences so severe that they would deter future generations from even contemplating resistance. The political context of 1305 was crucial to understanding Wallace's fate. By this time, most Scottish nobles had submitted to Edward's rule, seeing accommodation as preferable to annihilation. Wallace's continued resistance made him not just an enemy of England, but an embarrassment to the Scottish aristocracy who had chosen submission. His capture became a priority, not just for military reasons, but for political necessity. His very existence challenged the legitimacy of Scotland's surrender. The hunt for William Wallace lasted years, involving an extensive network of spies, informants, and collaborators. Edward I placed a substantial bounty on Wallace's head, and the English administration in Scotland worked systematically to isolate him from potential supporters. The net gradually tightened as former allies turned against him, driven by fear, greed, or simply the desire to survive in a world where association with Wallace had become synonymous with death. The betrayal came, as it often does in such stories, from within. In August 1305, Wallace was captured near Glasgow, likely through the treachery of Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had submitted to English rule. The exact circumstances remain debated by historians, but the outcome was clear. The man who had become the symbol of Scottish resistance was now in English hands. His capture was celebrated in London as a great victory, but for Edward I it was only the beginning of what he intended to be Wallace's ultimate humiliation. The journey from Scotland to London was itself a form of torture, designed to break Wallace's spirit before his final punishment. Bound and guarded, he was paraded through English towns where crowds gathered to see the infamous Scottish rebel. This was psychological warfare at its most calculated, the transformation of a hero into a spectacle, a leader into a curiosity. By the time Wallace reached London, he had already endured weeks of degradation, but his ordeal was far from over. The trial of William Wallace was a legal farce, but it served an important propaganda purpose for the English crown. Held at Westminster Hall on August 23, 1305, the proceedings were conducted in Latin, a language Wallace likely did not understand. He was charged with treason, murder, sacrilege, arson, and various other crimes against the English crown. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers. Wallace was being tried for treason against a king he had never acknowledged as his sovereign. When given the opportunity to speak, Wallace reportedly declared that he could not be guilty of treason against Edward I because he had never been Edward's subject. This defiant response sealed his fate, though in truth the outcome had been predetermined. The trial was theater, designed to provide a legal veneer to what was essentially a predetermined execution. The judges, all appointed by Edward I, had no intention of showing mercy to the man who had become the symbol of Scottish resistance. The charges against Wallace were carefully crafted to justify the severity of his punishment. Treason was the most serious offense, punishable by the full horror of hanging, drawing, and quartering. The additional charges of murder and sacrilege, referring to his attacks on English soldiers and clergy, were designed to portray him as a criminal rather than a warrior. The English legal system had become a weapon of state terror, and Wallace was to be its most prominent victim. The sentence was pronounced with ceremonial gravity. Wallace was to be drawn through the streets of London, hanged by the neck but not until dead, disemboweled while still alive, beheaded, and his body cut into 4 parts. Each element of this punishment carried symbolic meaning. The drawing represented his degradation, the hanging his rejection by heaven, the disemboweling his spiritual corruption, and the quartering his complete destruction. This was not merely execution, but annihilation. The morning of August 23, 1305, dawned clear and warm in London. The city had been preparing for this spectacle for days, with scaffolds erected and crowds gathering from across England to witness the death of the Scottish rebel. The authorities had turned Wallace's execution into a public holiday, complete with vendors selling food and drink to the assembled masses. This wasn't just about justice, it was entertainment, a reminder of the power of the English crown and the fate that awaited those who dared to challenge it. Wallace was first stripped and bound to a hurdle, a wooden frame that would drag him through the streets of London. The route had been carefully planned to maximize both the humiliation and the spectacle. From the Tower of London, where he had been held, the procession moved through the city's busiest districts, ensuring that as many people as possible would witness his degradation. The cobblestones tore at his flesh as he was dragged behind horses, leaving a trail of blood that marked his final journey. The crowds that lined the streets were a mixture of curiosity seekers, English patriots, and those who simply enjoyed witnessing the suffering of others. Medieval executions were public events, serving both as entertainment and as stark reminders of royal power. The spectators jeered and threw refuse at Wallace as he passed, their behavior encouraged by the authorities, who wanted to ensure that his final moments were as humiliating as possible. This was state-sponsored cruelty on a massive scale. The procession moved slowly, allowing maximum time for the crowds to gather and for Wallace's suffering to be prolonged. Contemporary accounts describe him as conscious throughout this ordeal, his eyes fixed on some distant point, as if seeing beyond the immediate horror of his situation. Whether this was defiance, resignation, or simple shock remains unknown. But witnesses noted that he never cried out or begged for mercy, a detail that would later become part of his legend. At Smithfield, London's traditional execution ground, a scaffold had been erected specifically for Wallace's death. The crowd here was even larger and more boisterous than along the route, with vendors selling pies and ale to spectators who had claimed the best viewing positions hours earlier. The carnival atmosphere was deliberate. The English authorities wanted Wallace's death to be remembered not as a martyrdom, but as a celebration of English justice and power. The executioner, a professional who had likely performed dozens of such killings, began his work with practiced efficiency. Wallace was first hanged by the neck, but the rope was positioned to ensure strangulation rather than a quick death by breaking the neck. The crowd watched as he struggled for breath, his face turning purple, his body convulsing in the universal dance of death by asphyxiation. But just as consciousness began to fade, he was cut down, still alive, still aware of what was happening to him. What followed was the most horrific part of the entire ordeal. While Wallace was still conscious, the executioner began the process of disemboweling him. Using a sharp knife, he cut open the abdomen and began removing the internal organs one by one. Contemporary accounts describe the victim's screams as unlike anything the witnesses had ever heard, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of human suffering itself. The executioner held up each organ for the crowd to see before throwing it into a fire that had been prepared for this purpose. The symbolism of burning Wallace's entrails was not accidental. In medieval thought, the bowels were considered the seat of emotion and compassion. By burning them while he watched, the executioner was symbolically destroying Wallace's humanity, reducing him to something less than human in the eyes of the crowd. The smell of burning flesh and organs filled the air, adding another layer of horror to an already nightmarish scene. Through all of this, Wallace remained conscious, his eyes open and aware, even as his body was systematically destroyed. Some accounts suggest that he continued to speak, though what he said has been lost to history. The executioner's skill lay not just in causing maximum pain, but in keeping the victim alive as long as possible. Death would come as a release, not as the culmination of suffering. Finally, mercifully, the executioner moved to complete his grisly work. Wallace's head was severed with a single stroke of a sharp axe, ending his suffering at last. But even in death, the humiliation continued. The head was held up for the crowd to see, blood still dripping from the severed neck, before being set aside for later display. The body was then cut into 4 quarters, each piece held up for the crowd's inspection, like cuts of meat in a butcher's shop. The disposal of Wallace's remains was as calculated as his execution. His head was dipped in tar to preserve it and mounted on a spike on London Bridge, where it would remain for years as a warning to anyone who might consider challenging English authority. The 4 quarters of his body were sent to different Scottish cities, Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, where they were displayed publicly as reminders of the fate that awaited rebels. This distribution of Wallace's body parts was more than mere brutality. It was a form of political communication. Each piece served as a message to the local population, a physical reminder of English power and the consequences of resistance. The English understood that symbols could be as powerful as armies, and Wallace's dismembered body became a symbol of English dominance over Scotland. The immediate aftermath of Wallace's execution was exactly what Edward the Martyr had hoped for. The brutal spectacle had served its purpose. Scottish resistance seemed to crumble in the face of such an overwhelming demonstration of English power. Many who had supported Wallace either fled the country or submitted to English rule, calculating that no cause was worth such a horrific death. The execution had successfully transformed a symbol of resistance into a warning against rebellion. But Edward the Fair had miscalculated the Scottish response to Wallace's martyrdom. Rather than crushing Scottish resistance, the brutality of Wallace's execution actually strengthened it. The very horror of his death became a rallying cry for those who refused to accept English domination. Robert the Bruce, who would later become King of Scotland, was reportedly moved to action by the spectacle of Wallace's execution, seeing in it the true face of English rule. The manner of Wallace's death also influenced the tactics of future Scottish resistance. The lesson was clear: capture by the English meant torture and humiliation beyond imagination. This knowledge led to a more desperate and determined form of warfare, where Scottish fighters preferred death in battle to surrender. Wallace's execution had created a culture of no quarter, where mercy was neither expected nor given. The political ramifications extended beyond Scotland's borders. Other European kingdoms watched the Wallace execution with interest and horror, seeing in it a demonstration of English methods that could easily be applied to them. The brutality of the execution became part of England's reputation, contributing to the isolation that would later complicate English foreign policy. Edward I's message of strength had been received, but so had his message of cruelty. The historical documentation of Wallace's execution is extensive, drawn from multiple contemporary sources that provide a remarkably detailed picture of the event. The Lanercost Chronicle, written by English monks, describes the execution in clinical detail, noting the crowd's reaction and the duration of Wallace's suffering. These accounts, while biased toward the English perspective, provide valuable insight into medieval attitudes toward justice and punishment. Scottish sources, though fewer in number, offer a different perspective. Chronicles like that of John of Fordun portray Wallace as a martyr who faced death with dignity and courage, emphasizing his refusal to beg for mercy or renounce his cause. These accounts, while perhaps romanticized, reflect the impact of Wallace's death on Scottish national consciousness and the transformation of a military defeat into a moral victory. The legal records of Wallace's trial and execution provide perhaps the most objective account of the events. These documents, preserved in the English National Archives, reveal the careful planning that went into both the trial and the execution. Every detail was documented, from the charges against Wallace to the disposal of his remains, suggesting that the English authorities understood the historical significance of what they were doing. Witness accounts from both English and Scottish observers provide additional layers of detail, some describing the crowd's bloodthirsty enthusiasm, while others note the apparent dignity with which Wallace faced his death. These varied perspectives highlight the complexity of the event and its different meanings for different audiences. The legacy of William Wallace's execution extends far beyond the immediate political consequences of his death. In the centuries that followed, his story became a foundational myth of Scottish nationalism, inspiring generations of Scots to resist foreign domination. The very brutality of his execution transformed him from a failed rebel into a symbol of martyrdom and resistance that proved more powerful in death than he had been in life. The execution also influenced the development of international law and concepts of human rights. Later, legal scholars would point to Wallace's treatment as an example of judicial cruelty that violated fundamental principles of human dignity. The notion that even enemies of the state deserved basic humane treatment began to emerge, partly as a reaction to excesses like Wallace's execution. The cultural impact of Wallace's death can be seen in the literature, art, and music that emerged in subsequent centuries. From medieval ballads to modern films, his story has been told and retold, each generation finding new meaning in his sacrifice. The execution scene, in particular, has become a powerful symbol of the struggle between oppression and freedom, tyranny and justice. The psychological impact on the Scottish people was profound and lasting. Wallace's execution created a collective trauma that became part of Scottish cultural identity, a shared memory of suffering that united the nation in ways that military victory alone could not have achieved. The horror of his death became a source of strength, proving that some things were worth suffering for and that dignity could be maintained even in the face of ultimate degradation. The method of execution chosen for Wallace, hanging, drawing, and quartering, was itself a statement about the nature of medieval justice and the relationship between ruler and subject. This particular form of execution was reserved for traitors, those who had violated the sacred bond between king and subject. By applying it to Wallace, Edward I was asserting that all inhabitants of the British Isles were his subjects, whether they acknowledged it or not. The public nature of the execution was equally significant. Medieval justice was theater, designed to reinforce social hierarchies and political relationships through spectacle. Wallace's execution was perhaps the most elaborate such performance of its era, involving not just the physical destruction of the victim but the psychological conditioning of the audience. The crowd was not merely witnessing justice, but participating in a ritual of state power. The detailed documentation of the execution suggests that the English authorities understood they were creating a historical moment. The careful recording of every detail, from the route of the procession to the disposal of the body parts, indicates that this was intended to be remembered. The execution was not just about punishing Wallace, but about creating a narrative that would serve English interests for generations to come. The international dimension of the execution should not be overlooked. Medieval Europe was an interconnected world where news traveled quickly and reputation mattered enormously. Wallace's execution was witnessed by foreign dignitaries and reported across the continent, contributing to England's reputation as a power willing to use extreme measures to maintain control. This reputation would influence diplomatic relations for decades to come. As we reflect on the horror of William Wallace's execution, we confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the exercise of power. The crowds that gathered to watch his suffering were not monsters but ordinary people who had been conditioned to accept and even enjoy the systematic destruction of another human being. Their enthusiasm for the spectacle reveals the capacity for cruelty that exists within civilized society when it is given official sanction. The execution also demonstrates how quickly the extraordinary can become routine. The executioner who dismembered Wallace was a professional, skilled in the art of prolonging suffering. The officials who organized the event were bureaucrats following established procedures for dealing with traitors. The normalization of extreme cruelty is perhaps more disturbing than the cruelty itself, suggesting that civilization is always more fragile than we might believe. The transformation of Wallace from rebel to martyr illustrates the unpredictable nature of political symbolism. Edward I intended the execution to demonstrate the futility of resistance, but instead, it created a powerful symbol of the nobility of sacrifice for principle. The very excess of the execution contributed to its failure as a deterrent. The horror was so complete that it became sublime, transcending its immediate purpose to become something larger. The enduring fascination with Wallace's story speaks to our need for heroes who embody our highest ideals, even in, or perhaps especially in, the face of ultimate suffering. His execution reminds us that the greatest victories are sometimes moral rather than military, that dignity can be maintained even when everything else is stripped away, and that the human spirit can triumph even in the moment of the body's destruction. The story of William Wallace's execution is ultimately a story about the price of freedom and the cost of principle. In our comfortable modern world, it is easy to forget that the liberties we take for granted were purchased with the blood and suffering of those who came before us. Wallace's horrific death serves as a reminder that freedom is never free, and that those who enjoy it have a responsibility to honor the sacrifice of those who died for it. Today, as we face our own challenges to freedom and human dignity, Wallace's story remains relevant. The methods may have changed, but the fundamental struggle between oppression and liberty continues. His execution reminds us that there are principles worth suffering for, causes worth dying for, and that the choice between freedom and security is one that each generation must make for itself. The blood-soaked cobblestones of medieval London echo still with the message that some things are worth any price, and that the human spirit, even when broken, can still inspire others to carry on the fight. What if I told you that one of the most powerful kings in European history, ruler of an empire so vast it stretched across continents, was so physically and mentally deformed that his own people believed he was possessed by demons? His name was Charles II of Spain, and to his subjects he wasn't just a monarch, he was a living curse. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched one. His face was distorted by a monstrous jaw, his speech a garbled murmur, and his body so broken it defied explanation. He couldn't walk properly, couldn't speak clearly, couldn't even eat without help, and most tragically of all, he couldn't produce an heir. But the truth behind Charles's condition wasn't supernatural. It wasn't witchcraft or divine punishment, it was genetics. Charles was the final product of centuries of inbreeding, a part of the infamous Habsburg dynasty's obsession with keeping power in the family. For generations, they married cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, believing they were preserving royal blood. Instead, they were unraveling their own genetic code. This is the haunting true story of a king whose body was a battleground of broken DNA, a man so medically compromised that his autopsy shocked even the most hardened physicians. This is the tragedy of a monarch whose death didn't just end a dynasty, it ignited a war that consumed half of Europe. Forget what you think you know about royal history. This isn't a tale of crowns and conquests. This is a slow-motion collapse, told through twisted bone and failing flesh. This is the tragedy of Charles II, the king destroyed by his own bloodline. When foreign envoys arrived at the Spanish court, expecting to meet the ruler of a global empire, they were met with a shock they couldn't conceal. Charles II, King of Spain, ruler of territories stretching across the world, couldn't even close his own mouth. His jaw jutted forward so grotesquely that his lips couldn't meet. His mouth hung open at rest, like a door ripped off its hinges. And this wasn't some tragic birth defect. It was the price of 200 years of incestuous ambition. You see, the Habsburgs believed in keeping the bloodline pure, but in practice that meant they turned marriage into a family reunion. Cousins married cousins, and uncles married nieces. The family tree didn't branch, it curled in on itself, like a snake eating its own tail. Charles's parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were also uncle and niece on both sides. By the time Charles was born, his gene pool had shrunk to the size of a muddy puddle. Medically, He had less diversity than someone from a centuries-isolated island tribe, and it showed. His most iconic feature was what doctors now call mandibular prognathism, but everyone else simply called it the Habsburg jaw. Charles's lower jaw didn't just protrude, it dominated his face. His top and bottom teeth didn't meet at all. You could slide a coin through the gap when his mouth was closed. Chewing was a fantasy, even talking was a struggle. Eating for Charles wasn't a royal ritual, it was a humiliation. Every meal had to be specially prepared into mush, as if he were an infant. Meats were minced, bread soaked until it dissolved, and everything pureed until it resembled baby food. And even then, it didn't guarantee success. Palace staff were assigned to discreetly wipe saliva from his chin. Soup dribbled constantly. Solid bits spilled out like crumbs from a broken puppet. Dinners meant to display royal grandeur became grotesque performances, with courtiers trying not to wince as their monarch slurped and drooled before them. His speech was nearly incomprehensible. His jaw deformity didn't just affect eating, it mangled language itself. Words came out wet and slurred like a mouthful of pebbles. Foreign diplomats required translators not for Spanish, but for Charles's Spanish. Even his mother, Queen Mariana, wrote privately of her terror that Charles might choke in his sleep, fearing his oversized tongue and distorted throat would betray him in the night. Imagine that. The King of Spain, once the ruler of the New World, reduced to a choking hazard. And the worst part? The Habsburgs knew this was happening. They saw the deformities getting worse with each generation. But power was more sacred than health, more sacred than their own children. Charles wasn't a fluke. He was a warning they ignored, and the jaw was just the beginning. Charles II's entire body was a masterclass in what happens when genetics go catastrophically wrong. At 35 years old, he looked like a sickly child, twisted and stretched like wax melting in the sun. He stood barely 5 feet tall, but it wasn't just about height. It was his proportions, grotesquely out of sync. His head was massive, too large for his thin, skeletal frame, and it bobbed weakly atop a neck that seemed too frail to hold it. His limbs were stick-like, bony, almost translucent. His torso was compressed as if someone had tried to squash him into the mold of a human being but failed. He didn't walk until he was 8. While toddlers stumble into their first steps before age 2, Charles spent almost a decade on the floor, too weak to support his own weight. Even after learning to walk, it wasn't walking, it was stumbling. A slow, uneven shuffle from one piece of furniture to another. He moved like an old man, not a prince in his prime. His spine was severely curved, permanently hunched. His silhouette looked like someone physically burdened, and in a way, he was. He carried the weight of centuries of genetic roulette. Mentally, the damage was just as tragic. Charles had the mind of a child well into his adulthood. He didn't learn to read until he was 10, and even then, it didn't stick. Court tutors described teaching him as like pouring water into a cracked jug. It went in, but nothing stayed. Emotionally, he was just as unstable. He'd throw tantrums over minor frustrations, screaming, flailing, and sobbing uncontrollably. Then came the silence. Hours spent staring into space, unresponsive, as if his mind had simply checked out. Even his hair told the story. It came in thin, brittle patches, constantly falling out. His scalp was blotchy and inflamed, more beast than royal. Official painters were instructed to beautify him, using clever angles, soft lighting, and selective imagination. But even the best artist couldn't mask the truth. And here's the most terrifying part. Charles wasn't born with all these issues. He got worse with age. Most people stabilize in their teens or 20s. Charles deteriorated. His body broke down faster than doctors could understand. It was as if nature itself was trying to reclaim him. But medicine had no answers, so the court began looking elsewhere. And that's where things got truly disturbing. Charles II wasn't just a tragic figure. He was a royal disaster waiting to happen. In the grand game of monarchy, there's one duty above all else: produce an heir. But Charles couldn't. Despite being the most powerful man in Europe, at least on paper, he was physically incapable of fulfilling the most basic requirement of kingship. He was married twice. and both unions ended the same way, in heartbreak, scandal, and total failure. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orléans, was a French princess, young, lively, and educated. She was raised to expect power, prestige, and, at the very least, a functional husband. But when she arrived in Madrid, she found herself married to a man who looked and acted like a fragile child in a king's robes. The wedding night was a catastrophe. It is reported that Marie-Louise emerged from the royal bedchamber in tears. Charles looked confused, distraught, perhaps even unaware of what was expected of him. Behind closed doors, royal physicians made a devastating discovery. Charles's reproductive organs were severely underdeveloped, described in the medical notes of the time as infantile. In modern terms, he had the sexual development of a prepubescent boy trapped in a malformed adult body. The Spanish court couldn't admit this, not publicly. The official narrative was that Marie-Louise was barren, and so began a years-long campaign of blame and humiliation. She was subjected to endless medical examinations, painful, invasive, and degrading. Herbal tonics, bloodletting, superstitious fertility rituals. Some concoctions were so vile they induced vomiting and hallucinations. But no pregnancy ever came, because the problem was never her. It was Charles. The psychological toll on Marie-Louise was immense. Once known for her sharp wit and cheerful disposition, she became quiet, withdrawn, and deeply depressed. When she died suddenly at just 26, rumors exploded. Was it illness, a broken heart, or had she been slowly poisoned by the very fertility cures forced upon her? In a last-ditch effort, Charles remarried. His second wife was Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess from a family known for fertility. But Charles's condition had deteriorated further, and this marriage too would be barren. Europe, meanwhile, was watching. Everyone knew that without an heir, the Spanish throne would become the biggest prize in European politics. France, Austria, England, they all had claims, and they were preparing to enforce them with armies. Diplomats called it succession planning, but it was vultures circling a dying empire. The Habsburgs had spent centuries orchestrating marriages to keep power in the family, but that very obsession had bred them into extinction. When science failed, the Spanish court turned to something far older, the church, and not just for prayer, for exorcism. By the end of Charles's life, royal physicians had been replaced by priests, and the throne room itself had become the stage for full-blown demonic expulsions. In the minds of many, there was only one explanation left. Charles was possessed. The court's leading exorcist claimed that Charles housed dozens of demons, that witches had cursed him in the womb. And so the rituals began, not in secret, but as public events conducted in the royal palace. Imagine it, the King of Spain, writhing on the cold stone floor while robed priests circled him, chanting Latin invocations and splashing him with holy water. Crosses were pressed against his chest until he screamed. Crosses were ground into powder and mixed into his drinking water, which he'd swallow, then promptly vomit violently. To the priests, that was proof the demons were reacting. Each time he collapsed, they claimed another demon had been expelled. By 1699, one priest claimed they had identified and exorcised 47 demons, each supposedly responsible for a different symptom. In his desperation, Charles believed it was working. The rituals gave him something medicine never could: hope. But that hope came at a price. The exorcisms left him physically exhausted and bedridden, pushing his already weakened body to the edge. The Spanish court was less a government than a desperate asylum where royal power had given way to medieval superstition. On November 1st, 1700, the bewitched king finally died. Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, passed away at the age of 38. No heir, no legacy, just whispers, rumors, and a broken empire. But even in death, Charles's body held one final secret. Royal physicians conducted an autopsy, hoping to put the rumors of demons to rest. Instead, they unleashed something far worse. The report, penned by Dr. Geronimo de la Fuente Pierola, was so shocking it was immediately suppressed, but the details eventually leaked. According to the report, Charles's heart was shriveled, blackened, and no larger than a walnut. His lungs were decayed and filled with gangrene, rotting from within. His intestines were described as putrefied, and his stomach was full of fluid and bile. His reproductive organs were catastrophically underdeveloped, confirming he had been biologically incapable of reproduction. But the final discovery was the most chilling. When physicians opened his skull, they found it filled with an abnormal amount of fluid, a condition we now know as hydrocephalus. His brain tissue was discolored and partially deteriorated. Dr. Pirola concluded with a line that echoed through every royal court in Europe. "It is a miracle this body sustained life for so long, as it contained not a single sound organ." The findings didn't dispel the myths, they fed them. How could a man so internally corrupted even function? To the superstitious, it was proof he had been touched by something beyond this world. But there was no magic at work, only biology. When Charles died, the Spanish Empire was leaderless. What followed was one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 18th century, the War of the Spanish Succession. It dragged on for 13 years, drew in nearly every major European nation, and killed hundreds of thousands. All because one man, broken from birth, couldn't fulfill the one duty he was born for. It was the final, violent exclamation mark on a dynasty that believed genetic purity meant divine right. Instead, it produced Charles II. The most powerful family in Europe had bred itself into biological extinction. Today, Charles II is often remembered as a footnote, a strange, almost pitiful king whose reign collapsed into failure. But look closer, and you'll see something far more haunting. He wasn't just a bad king. He was a biological warning, a symbol of what happens when human ambition overrides human limits. The Habsburgs saw the warning signs. Each generation grew sicker, more fragile, more malformed. But instead of changing course, they doubled down. They lied, covered it up, called it witchcraft, blamed their wives, and hired priests. In the end, biology doesn't care about politics. It doesn't care about thrones, titles, or divine rights. It just breaks, quietly and fatally. And when it did, it took a dynasty and half of Europe with it. So the next time you hear someone romanticize royal bloodlines or dream of being born into power, remember Charles II, the king with no heir, no healthy organ, and no chance from the very beginning. A king who died not from assassination, betrayal, or war, but from being exactly what his family created him to be. If this kind of dark, forgotten history fascinates you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Tell me what royal secrets, strange rulers, or historical mysteries I should uncover next, because the past isn't always what you learned in school. Sometimes, it's far darker.